You can go. We don't need you here.
All right. That system still needs the calibration I warned you about.
Wait, can you fix it?
$200, Claire Whitmore said, sliding the check across the conference table. That should cover your time and your ride home. Marcus Reed looked the check, then at the prototype housing between them under the fluorescent lights of Whitmore Dynamics Test Lab. He was 46, dark-skinned, with close-cropped hair silvering at the temples and rectangular safety glasses low on his nose. He had spent 3 weeks troubleshooting the company's overheating battery control unit under a temporary consulting agreement. The written terms promised him final review access before any design decision was locked. Claire had just canceled that review and replaced it with a dismissal check. "I'm not asking for a favor," Marcus said. He tapped the binder he had brought, its corners softened from use. "Section 12 gives me sign-off access because the thermal fault is still unresolved." Claire leaned back. "You were brought in to advise, not to slow down a launch. Engineering has already moved on." Across the table, Junior Systems Engineer Elena Parks stopped typing. She had been in every failure test that week and knew the control board had still spiked above its safe threshold under load. Marcus saw her glance toward the closed glass door, then back to her screen. Claire was the founder and chief executive. Elena was 29 and 6 months into a job she needed. Marcus opened the binder to the marked page. "Then have engineering note in the record that I objected to release." Claire's mouth tightened. "Marcus, I'm trying to make this easy. Take the money, leave the badge, and let my team finish." The phrasing hit harder than the amount. Claire had reduced 3 weeks of work, 28 documented test cycles, and a signed consulting clause to a nuisance fee. Marcus had promised his 22-year-old daughter, Naya, that he would stop accepting assignments where respect arrived only after something broke. Standing there, he realized he had meant it. He folded the check once and set it beside Claire's coffee. "I'll leave when you give me written confirmation that my access is being terminated before final validation." Claire gave a short exhale. "You really want paperwork for this?" "Yes." That answer changed Elena's posture. She turned from her laptop and said, "The thermal run from Tuesday is still flagged open in the validation system." Claire looked at her. "It's been reviewed." "Not closed," Elena said. Her voice thinned, but she did not retract the sentence. Marcus watched her hands settle flat on the table. That small act of steadiness mattered more than any dramatic declaration. Claire's expression cooled. "Elena, send me the file after this meeting." Marcus knew what that meant. The issue was no longer whether the fault existed. It was whether the record would remain intact after he walked out. He reached for the worn mechanical pencil clipped inside his binder, a habit from his years in industrial controls, and wrote the time beside his final test note. Then he signed beneath it. "I'm submitting this as my formal objection to release." Claire stood. "You're making a simple disagreement unnecessarily difficult." "No," Marcus said. "I'm making it traceable." For the first time, Claire looked past him toward Elena's laptop. Marcus caught the flicker there, not fear exactly, but calculation. She pressed the intercom and asked operations to deactivate his building credentials immediately. A soft chime sounded from Marcus's phone before the door opened. His access badge had already been disabled. He picked up his binder, left the check where it was, and handed the badge to the facility's supervisor in the doorway. Behind him, Elena quietly saved Tuesday's test file to the company's protected validation archive, creating the first action Claire could no longer reverse with a conversation. Marcus stepped into the hall knowing he had just lost the contract. He also knew the fault now had a timestamp. By the time Marcus reached the parking garage, the dismissal had already begun affecting something Claire could not see from the conference room. His phone buzzed with a message from Nia asking whether the meeting had gone better than the last one. Marcus stood beside his aging blue pickup and stared at the screen. He almost typed, "Same story, different building," but deleted it. Instead he wrote, "Contract ended early. I'm okay. Dinner at 7?" Then he put the phone away and opened the passenger door to set down his binder. He had lost the assignment, but he had kept one promise to himself. He had left a clean record behind. Inside Whitmore Dynamics, Claire moved quickly to keep the launch schedule intact. She told operations that Marcus had become uncooperative around scope and asked legal to review whether his objection created any contractual delay. Alana heard the phrasing through the open doorway and felt her stomach tighten. The Tuesday test had not been ambiguous. Under sustained load, the control board had climbed past the temperature ceiling before the protection circuit reacted. She had been the one who reset the rig after the cutoff. When Claire asked her for the archived run, Elena sent the file exactly as stored, including Marcus's notes and the unresolved flag. The complication arrived 30 minutes later, when legal counsel Dana Brooks replied that Claire could not exclude Marcus's objection from the release package. The consulting agreement tied final validation access to any unresolved safety-related deviation, which meant his removal did not erase his documented role. Claire read the email twice, then called Elena back into the lab. "Did he tell you to preserve that file?" she asked. Elena shook her head. "I saved the normal archive copy." Claire looked toward the test rack. "And you agree with him?" Elena hesitated. "I agree that the run is still open." It was not the answer Claire wanted, but it was the most accurate one Elena could give. Marcus, meanwhile, stopped at a neighborhood hardware store before going home because Naya had asked him to fix a loose cabinet hinge in her apartment. The small task settled him. He spent $12 on screws and a better anchor, then helped an older customer reach a box from a high shelf when the clerk was busy. By the time he got back to his truck, his anger had thinned into something more useful. He opened his binder and photographed the site's objection for his own records, careful not to copy proprietary test data. Then he emailed Dana Brooks a short notice confirming the time his access had been terminated and asking that his contractual objection remain attached to the validation file. At Whitmore Dynamics, Claire's launch meeting stalled over that same sentence. The company's largest customer, a transit manufacturer, had a scheduled demonstration in 4 days, and the purchase order depended on successful thermal validation. Claire could postpone the test, disclose the open deviation, or attempt to complete the review without Marcus. None of the options fit the promise she had already made to investors. "Can our internal team close it?" she asked. The engineering director answered carefully. "Maybe. But Marcus designed the diagnostic method we're using. We can reproduce it, but not by tomorrow morning." Claire's jaw did not drop. She stopped tapping her pen. That evening, Marcus was halfway through tightening Naya's cabinet hinge when Dana called. She did not ask him to come back, and she did not apologize for Claire. She asked one precise question. Would he participate in an independent validation session if the company restored his review access and put the scope in writing? Marcus looked at Naya, who was holding the cabinet door level with both hands. He covered the phone and said, "They want help." Naya raised an eyebrow. "Do they want help, or do they want the problem gone?" Marcus almost smiled. He returned to the call. "Send the terms first," he said. "Then I'll decide." Marcus did not answer Dana's email until after breakfast. The proposed terms restored his validation access for 48 hours, limited his authority to technical review, and guaranteed that any unresolved deviation would remain attached to the customer package. The draft still allowed management to close the review without his concurrence. Marcus highlighted that sentence and sent it back with one change. Disagreement had to be recorded, not overridden quietly. Naya watched him from the kitchen counter. "You're going back?" she asked. "Maybe," he said, "but not as the guy they can erase." At Whitmore Dynamics, Claire was learning how much of the launch had rested on assumptions rather than finished work. Luis Ortega had rerun Tuesday's conditions overnight and reproduced the spike twice. He could not yet prove whether the fault came from the control board, the sensor calibration, or the protective software. Claire wanted a narrower answer. "Can we demonstrate safely on Friday?" Luis rubbed a thumb along the edge of the test log. "Not responsibly with the current configuration." Elena sat beside him, silent until Claire asked whether Marcus's method was necessary. "His method isolates the failure faster," she said. "Necessary? Useful? Very." Claire's first instinct was to challenge the wording, but Dana interrupted before she could. We need to separate schedule pressure from technical judgment. Nobody was accusing her of misconduct. They were refusing to let urgency become evidence. Dana placed Marcus's revised clause on the table and said the company could accept it without surrendering management authority. Claire stared at the page. Now the transit customer's demonstration depended on precisely that kind of procedure. Fine, she said, accept it. And make sure he understands this is temporary. Marcus returned just after noon wearing a canvas work jacket instead of the blazer he had used for the original consulting meetings. His mechanical pencil was clipped inside the pocket. Claire met him at the lab entrance, where a temporary badge waited beside the sign-in tablet. "I appreciate you coming back," she said. Marcus signed the visitor log. "I came back for the test." Inside, Elena had already staged the diagnostic rig with Luis. Marcus greeted both of them, then asked Elena to walk him through the overnight runs before he touched anything. She expected him to take control. Instead, he handed her the marker and said, "Show me where your confidence drops." Elena traced the temperature curve across the whiteboard and stopped at the protection delay. Marcus asked 3 questions, then one more about the replacement sensors installed the previous month. Luis pulled the maintenance record. The batch numbers did not match the specification in Marcus's original diagnostic notes. That did not prove the sensors were defective, but it gave them a testable difference. They swapped one unit from the older validated batch into the rig and re-ran the load cycle. The temperature still climbed, but the protection circuit triggered 6 seconds earlier. Marcus frowned rather than celebrating. "Good," he said. "Now we know the sensor matters. We still don't know if it's the whole problem." Claire had been standing behind the glass partition for nearly an hour when Marcus finally looked toward her. She came into the lab without her phone. "What do you need?" she asked. He pointed to the procurement record on Luis's screen. "A hold on that sensor batch, access to the supplier change notice, and another full run after software review." Claire glanced at Dana, then at Elena. "Do it." There was no apology in the order, but there was something Marcus had not heard from her before. Restraint. As operations placed the hold, Elena found the supplier notice in the archive. The specification had been changed 3 weeks earlier, and someone had approved the substitution without routing it through validation. The supplier notice changed the room more than any accusation could have. Luis opened the document on the lab monitor and scrolled to the approval chain. The substitution had been authorized by Operations Procurement, then marked equivalent before validation ever saw it. Claire recognized the name immediately. Martin Vale, her vice president of operations, had signed the exception while she was pushing every department to protect the Friday demonstration. Marcus did not look at her. He asked Elena to print the notice, then said, "Before we decide what this means, we need the original specification and the reason for the change." Martin arrived 20 minutes later carrying a tablet, and the defensive patience of someone who believed the question had already been settled. He explained that the supplier had warned of a shortage, the replacement sensors met the purchase specification, and delaying procurement would have threatened the schedule. On paper, the decision sounded reasonable. The problem emerged when Elena compared the purchase specification with the engineering tolerance table. Procurement had matched voltage and temperature range, but missed the response time requirement used by the protection circuit. Martin frowned at the screen. "That requirement wasn't in the vendor sheet," Luis answered. "It was in the validation package." Claire felt the shape of her own mistake before anyone named it. She had spent weeks telling teams to remove friction from the launch, and Martin had interpreted friction as anything that slowed delivery. She had not ordered him to bypass validation. She had rewarded the behavior that made bypassing it seem useful. Marcus could have said that aloud. Instead, he asked Martin who else had received the supplier notice. Martin checked the routing history. Procurement, me, and Claire's office. Claire looked up. Her assistant had forwarded it while she was traveling. She had skimmed the subject line and approved the schedule impact without opening the attachment. For the first time since Marcus returned, Claire addressed him, without trying to control the frame. I missed it. The words came out flatter than she intended. Marcus adjusted his safety glasses and glanced toward the rig. Then, fix what happens next. He did not absolve her, and he did not turn the admission into a victory. Claire asked Dana to document the approval failure, instructed Martin to preserve every communication related to the substitution, and authorized Luis to suspend the Friday demonstration pending validation. Martin started to protest about the customer. Claire cut him off. "We tell them we found an unresolved issue before shipment. That is the truth." The decision cost them immediately. Sales called within minutes to say the transit customer wanted a written explanation, and finance estimated that a delayed demonstration could push the order into the next quarter. Marcus saw Claire absorb the number without reaching for a shortcut. He returned to the test bench with Elena and Luis. Together they reviewed the software timing against the old and new sensor response curves. Elena spotted a compensation setting that had been tuned using the original batch. Marcus asked her to build the next test plan herself. "You found the dependency," he said. "You should own the run." Her surprise lasted only a second before she nodded. Near 7, the lab lights dimmed automatically for evening mode while Elena prepared the new configuration. Claire stood outside the test area, holding the untouched $200 check she had retrieved from the conference room. She folded it once, then tore it in half and dropped it into the recycling bin without ceremony. Marcus noticed but said nothing. The next run would determine whether the sensor substitution explained the protection delay or merely exposed a deeper control problem. Elena raised her hand over the start switch and looked to Marcus. He shook his head toward her console. "Your test," he said. Elena pressed start, and the temperature trace began to climb. The new run held steady for 9 minutes before the protection circuit tripped exactly where Elena's model predicted. She stared at the graph, then at Marcus. The temperature rise was slower, the cutoff cleaner, and the 6-second delay had disappeared. Luis exhaled through his nose. So the sensor substitution was part of it. Marcus nodded, but pointed to the remaining oscillation in the control signal. Part of it, yes. Not all of it. Elena zoomed in on the trace. The software compensation was still overcorrecting under sustained load. Claire, standing behind them, understood enough to hear the difference between good news and clearance. "Can it be fixed tonight?" she asked. Marcus answered, "It can be understood tonight. That's not the same thing." They divided the work instead of pretending urgency had vanished. Luis rebuilt the calibration table, Elena compared the current firmware against the last validated version, and Marcus reviewed the protection logic without touching the source code. He caught himself reaching automatically for Elena's keyboard and stopped. "You drive," he said. "I'll tell you what I'm seeing." She gave him a tired half-smile. "You're enjoying this. Not the part where we're still here at 8:30. Claire ordered food for the lab, then hesitated before placing the order. "Any allergies?" It was a small question, almost embarrassingly ordinary, but Marcus that she was asking rather than deciding. The deeper problem surfaced while Elena compared 2 software builds. A performance update added 10 days earlier had shortened a sampling interval to improve response speed during demonstrations. With the original sensors, the change remained inside tolerance. With the substituted batch, the timing difference created a feedback loop that delayed the protective cutoff under sustained load. No single person had created the fault. Procurement had changed hardware, software had changed timing, and validation had been kept outside both decisions. The system had failed because separate reasonable choices had never been forced into the same room. Marcus leaned back from the monitor. "That's your real problem," he said. "Not one bad sensor. Your change controls don't talk to each other." Claire looked through the glass toward Martin, who had remained after his earlier interview with Dana. Firing him would have been simple and emotionally satisfying. It also would have hidden the structure that had allowed his decision to pass. She asked Dana to arrange an independent review of the change control process and told Martin he would be removed from approval authority while that review was underway. Martin's shoulders dropped. You think I caused all of this? Claire shook her head. I think I helped create a system where you thought speed mattered more than cross-checking. You still signed it. Both things can be true. Marcus watched without comment. Accountability, he knew, mattered most when it did not arrive as theater. By 10:15, Elena had a revised test configuration ready. Before starting, she looked at Marcus. If this passes, does that mean we're done? He shook his head. It means we've earned the next test. She laughed once, tired but genuine. The second run completed without exceeding the temperature ceiling, and the protection circuit responded inside specification. Luis clapped her shoulder, then caught himself and asked, "Okay if I celebrate yet?" Elena pointed at Marcus. "Apparently we have to earn that too." Even Claire smiled. The mood lasted only seconds before Marcus asked for 3 repeat runs and independent verification in the morning. Nobody objected. As the lab began shutting down, Claire followed Marcus into the corridor. "I was wrong about you," she said. He stopped but did not rescue her from the sentence. "You were wrong about more than me." Claire nodded. "I know." She told him the transit customer had agreed to postpone the demonstration for 48 hours if Whitmore Dynamics provided an independent validation report and a corrective action plan. Without Marcus's diagnostic method, meeting that condition would be difficult. "I need you to stay through verification," she said. This time there was no check on the table, no shortcut disguised as generosity. Marcus glanced back at Elena documenting the final run. "Send me a proper scope," he said, "and include her in the review." The revised scope arrived before Marcus reached home. It gave him authority to participate in independent verification, required his objections to remain attached to the final validation record, and named Elena as technical co-lead for the corrective test. He read it twice at the kitchen table while Naya reheated leftovers. "Better?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "Better because it's specific." He signed electronically, then picked up the screwdriver he had left on the counter. The cabinet hinge still needed one final adjustment. Nia smiled. "Saving companies can wait 5 minutes." Marcus tightened the last screw. "This isn't about saving a company. It's about whether they learn why it almost failed." By 7 the next morning, an outside engineering firm had joined the lab through a secure review channel. Their lead validator, Priya Shah, 41, asked for the failure conditions, hardware substitution record, firmware history, and acceptance criteria. Claire tried to summarize the issue. Priya stopped her politely. "I'd rather hear the test sequence from the people who ran it." Claire stepped back. Elena explained the thermal spike, Luis described the replacement batch, and Marcus outlined his diagnostic method. When Priya asked who could declare the unit ready, everyone finally gave the same answer. The validation board, after documented sign-off. The first repeat run passed. The second showed a brief signal oscillation that stayed inside tolerance. Priya would not call it a failure, but she would not let anyone ignore it. Marcus asked Elena what she wanted to test next. She studied the curve and proposed holding sustained load longer than the customer demonstration required. Claire glanced at the clock, then caught herself. "Do it," she said. The extended run exposed no dangerous delay, but it revealed a logging error in the monitoring software that had been masking short fluctuations. The product was safer than it had been 2 days earlier, yet the company's records were less reliable than Claire had believed. During lunch, Claire found Marcus in the break room washing coffee from a chipped mug. "I owe you an apology," she said. Marcus dried it with a paper towel. "For what part?" Claire gave a tired laugh. Then she named it, dismissing his contract rights, assuming he was obstructing the launch, and offering money as if the dispute were about compensation. Marcus listened without rescuing her from the discomfort. "I don't need you embarrassed," he said. "I need the process to be harder to abuse next time." Claire nodded. "Then help me design that." Marcus shook his head. "I'll help Elena and Luis design it. You need to make sure they're allowed to tell you no." That afternoon, the independent team issued a preliminary finding. The thermal fault came from the interaction between the unvalidated sensor substitution and the software timing change, while the monitoring error had obscured the pattern. Priya recommended a temporary shipping hold, corrected logging, supplier requalification, and a cross-functional approval rule for changes affecting safety controls. Claire accepted all four. Martin's approval authority remained suspended pending review, but Dana made clear that any employment consequence would follow the investigation. The transit customer received the same findings and agreed to reschedule its demonstration after corrective validation rather than cancel the order. For Claire, the difference mattered. Transparency had cost time, but concealment would have cost trust. Near the end of the day, Elena printed the new change control draft and laid it beside Marcus's binder. Engineering, software, procurement, and validation would have since the same release record instead of passing changes through separate chains. Marcus ran a finger down the signature fields. "This is closer," he said. Elena looked toward Claire's office. "Do you think she means it?" Marcus considered the question. "Meaning it today is easy. Building something that still works when everyone's under pressure is harder." Across the lab, Claire was canceling Friday's launch celebration and replacing it with a working review. Marcus closed the binder. The company had not been saved yet, but for the first time, it was learning where saving had to begin. The working review began the next morning with the validation board standing around the test rig instead of sitting behind a conference table. Priya asked Elena to recreate the original failure path from memory, then compare it with the corrected configuration. Claire stayed near the back wall with Dana and said nothing until Priya invited her in. Elena walked through the sensor substitution, the firmware timing change, and the monitoring error, pausing whenever Luis challenged an assumption. Marcus listened for gaps rather than mistakes. When Elena finished, Priya pointed to the board. "Now tell us what would have stopped this before it reached validation." Elena looked at the new approval chain, one shared change record, and permission to delay release without needing an executive to agree first. That answer pushed the review beyond the technical fault. Dana asked Martin to explain why procurement had treated the replacement sensors as equivalent. He did not deny the signature. He described the shortage, the supplier pressure, and Claire's repeated warnings that the demonstration date could not move. "I thought I was protecting the launch," he said. Claire looked down at the printed timeline. Marcus noticed that she did not interrupt. Priya asked whether anyone had told Martin to bypass validation. No. Whether the company's incentives made delay feel unacceptable. Martin hesitated. Yes, the distinction did not erase his decision, but it made the board confront a process that had rewarded speed while leaving safety review dependent on personal courage. Priya then asked for a live demonstration of the new control path. Elena loaded the corrected firmware while Luis installed a sensor from the replacement batch. This time the board required the software to recognize the slower response and adjust its protection timing automatically. Marcus checked the test conditions, then stepped away from the console. "Run it the way the field unit will actually see it." Elena started the cycle. Temperature climbed under sustained load, the signal oscillated once, and the protection circuit compensated without breaching the threshold. Priya requested a second run with the older sensor batch. That passed too. The system was no longer safe only under one preferred configuration. It was behaving correctly across both validated inputs. The decisive test came when Priya deliberately introduced the logging error that had hidden the earlier fluctuations. Under the old process, the monitoring screen would have shown a clean line. Under the revised configuration, the system flagged the missing samples and blocked final sign-off until the data stream was complete. Luis let out a low whistle. "So even if somebody misses the pattern, the release can't move," Elena nodded. Marcus felt the tension in his shoulders ease for the first time all week. The fix was not a heroic technician watching every graph forever. It was a process designed to make one person's silence less dangerous. Claire asked Priya whether the board now had enough for a decision. Priya answered carefully. The product could proceed to corrective validation, but the shipping hold should remain until 2 more independent runs and the supplier requalification were complete. She also recommended that Martin remain outside change approval while Dana's review continued, not as punishment, but to protect the integrity of the process. Claire accepted both recommendations without bargaining over the schedule. Then she looked at Marcus. "Would you stay through the customer demonstration?" He shook his head. "Elena can lead it." Claire's surprise showed. Marcus added, "If your process only works when I'm in the room, we didn't fix anything." Elena looked at him, then at the board. "I'll lead it," she said. The meeting ended with Priya signing the preliminary validation record and Elena adding her own name beneath it. Claire signed last, beside a new acknowledgement that unresolved technical objections could not be removed from the release package without written review. Marcus closed his binder and slipped the mechanical pencil back into his jacket. As people began leaving, Claire stopped him near the lab door. "I thought I needed you to save the company." Marcus glanced through the glass at Elena resetting the rig for the next run. "You needed people you already had to be allowed to stop it from hurting itself." Claire followed his gaze. For once, she did not argue. The next test belonged to Elena, and everyone in the building now knew it. Elena's 2 remaining validation runs passed the following morning, but the supplier requalification took another day. That delay mattered because the transit customer had already moved its demonstration team and expected an answer before committing another travel budget. Claire wanted to push for an accelerated review, then stopped herself before the request became an instruction. She asked Priya what could be shortened without weakening the result. "Documentation handoff," Priya said, "not the testing." Claire accepted that distinction and assigned operations staff to prepare the records instead of asking engineering to work another overnight. Marcus heard about the choice from Elena and realized Claire was beginning to separate urgency from permission. Marcus used the unexpected free afternoon to visit Nia at the community workshop, where she volunteered twice a month repairing donated appliances. She had inherited his habit of keeping screws in labeled jars and his dislike of throwing away anything that could still be useful. When a 24-year-old volunteer struggled with a damaged fan motor, Marcus crouched beside the bench and showed him how to test continuity before replacing parts. Nia watched from across the room. "You know you teach differently when nobody's paying you," she said later. Marcus smiled. "People listen differently when they don't think every question is costing them money." The remark stayed with him longer than he expected. Back at Whitmore Dynamics, Dana completed the first stage of the internal review. Martin had violated the company's existing validation procedure by approving the sensor substitution without routing it through engineering, but he had also followed an informal practice several senior managers admitted using when schedule pressure was high. Dana recommended a formal warning, removal from unilateral approval authority, and retraining rather than immediate termination. Claire agreed, though Martin's role would remain restricted for 6 months. More importantly, the board approved the cross-functional change process as a permanent control. No hardware or software change affecting safety limits could bypass validation, and technical objections would remain visible until formally resolved. When Marcus returned for the customer demonstration, he found Elena at the front of the lab rehearsing her explanation with Luis. She stopped when she saw him. "You're early. You're nervous, I'm aware." Marcus handed her the mechanical pencil from his binder. "Then, keep your hands busy." Elena laughed and tucked it behind her ear. The customer team arrived with Priya and 2 engineers of their own. Claire introduced Elena as the technical lead, not Marcus. That mattered. Elena described the original fault, demonstrated the corrected protection response, and answered questions about the new change control rule without pretending the company had handled the first failure well. The demonstration passed all acceptance conditions. The customer's lead engineer still asked for 30 days of monitored field data before approving full deployment, which pushed part of the order into the next quarter. Claire accepted the condition. The company would lose short-term revenue and spend more on validation than planned, but the purchase agreement remained intact. After the visitors left, Claire found Marcus near the loading bay. "You could have made this easier for me," she said, then shook her head at her own wording. "No, that's not what I mean." Marcus waited. Claire tried again. You made it harder to pretend we were ready. That probably kept us in business. Marcus looked toward the lab windows, where Elena was returning his pencil to the binder. You kept yourself in business when you stopped asking people to protect your schedule from the truth. Claire nodded. She offered him a longer consulting contract to help audit the company's other validation processes. Marcus did not answer immediately. The old version of him might have accepted simply to prove the point had been won. Instead, he asked for the scope, the decision rights, and the exit terms in writing. Then he added one condition of his own. Elena would help lead the audit and receive formal credit for the work. Claire said yes. Marcus opened his binder to a clean page. The first audit meeting began without Claire at the head of the table. Marcus noticed that immediately. Elena sat beside Dana with the change control records open, while Luis had test summaries and supplier notices arranged by date. Claire took a seat halfway down the table and let Elena lead. The review covered 3 products, not just the battery control unit, and the pattern was uncomfortable. Schedule exceptions had been treated as harmless shortcuts whenever no failure appeared right away. Marcus did not call it corruption. He called it drift. Nobody wakes up deciding to build an unsafe process, he said. You keep rewarding the shortcut until it feels normal. The audit produced consequences before anyone could turn them into a speech. One product line paused a planned software update until validation reviewed its interaction with older hardware. Another team discovered that 2 supplier substitutions had never been documented in the engineering record. Dana opened corrective actions for both. Claire also changed the performance goals for operations managers so delivery speed could not be scored separately from validation compliance. The change cost her a quarterly efficiency target she had promised the board. When finance asked whether the target could be preserved another way, Claire answered no. For Marcus, that mattered more than an apology. She was finally allowing the correction to hurt. Martin accepted the formal warning, but not gracefully. He asked to speak with Marcus privately after the meeting. In the empty test bay, he said, "You know I'm the one everyone will remember." Marcus leaned against the workbench. "You signed the exception." Martin nodded, and Claire pushed the schedule. Both can be true. Martin rubbed his forehead. He admitted that when Elena had raised concerns weeks earlier, he had told her not to become the person who blocks every launch. He had not meant it as a threat. Marcus did not argue about intent. Then tell her what you said, and tell her you were wrong to make caution sound like disloyalty. Martin found Elena before the end of the day. His apology was awkward, incomplete, and better for it. He did not claim he had always respected her judgment. He told her he had made her professional caution expensive by tying it to reputation, and that he would correct the performance note he had placed in her file after the earlier disagreement. Elena listened with her arms crossed. "I'm not asking you to like how I work," she said. "I'm asking you not to punish me for doing it." Martin agreed and sent the correction to Dana, while Elena watched. The record changed before their relationship did. Marcus thought that was the honest order. The board reviewed the audit findings 2 days later. Claire did not lose her job, and Martin was not fired. Instead, the board approved the new cross-functional controls, required quarterly independent validation reviews for a year, and tied executive compensation partly to compliance measures. Claire would also report the 30-day field data from the transit deployment before any expansion order was recognized as final revenue. What unsettled her was seeing, in writing, how many people had learned to anticipate what she wanted and edit their warnings accordingly. She asked Marcus afterward, "How do you fix that?" He answered, "By surviving a few answers you don't like." That evening, Marcus and Naya ate takeout at her apartment with the repaired cabinet door hanging straight above them. His new consulting agreement was still unsigned in his bag. The company had stabilized, the customer had stayed, and Elena now had formal authority in the validation process. None of that meant Marcus owed Whitmore Dynamics his future. Naya pushed the carton of noodles toward him. "So are you taking the job?" Marcus looked at the contract, then at the hinge he had finally fixed. "Not the job they offered," he said. He had decided to propose a 6-month independent audit instead, with a fixed end date and Elena as internal lead. For once, staying would have boundaries. Marcus's 6-month proposal changed the conversation because it gave everyone an ending date. Claire accepted the structure, but only after Dana rewrote the scope so the audit could report directly to the board committee overseeing risk. Elena would run the internal workstream. Marcus would test whether the new controls held under real pressure, and neither could be removed from the process without written cause. The agreement also excluded product design authority, which mattered to Marcus. He was not there to become indispensable. On Monday morning, he signed the final page, then handed Elena back his mechanics pencil. "You're going to need your own," he said. "That one's older than you." The first real test came sooner than anyone wanted. A supplier notified Whitmore Dynamics that a component used in another control module would be unavailable for 3 weeks. Sales had already promised delivery dates to 2 customers, and operations proposed an alternate part that matched the basic specification. 6 months earlier, the change might have been approved with a quick email. This time, the request entered the shared change record, automatically routing to procurement, engineering, software, and validation. Martin, still under restricted authority, prepared the substitution packet and sent it forward without marking it urgent. Elena noticed that. He noticed her noticing. Neither said anything until she asked for additional thermal data. The extra test pushed the schedule by 1 day. Nobody celebrated that. Sales complained, operations recalculated shipping, and Claire took a tense call from a customer who wanted to know why a small component required another review. She explained the delay without blaming validation. Then she called Elena afterward. "I wanted to tell them we'd make the date anyway," Claire admitted. Elena waited. "But you didn't." Claire looked through the glass wall toward the lab. "No, I'm trying to learn what not fixing it feels like." Elena smiled despite herself. "Mostly paperwork," Claire laughed once. It was the first conversation between them that did not feel like a performance review. The alternate component passed electrical testing but failed under vibration at the edge of its operating range. The old system would likely have missed that because the original request described the parts as equivalent. Under the new process, the validation record blocked release automatically. Martin was the one who called operations and stopped the substitution. When Elena thanked him later, he looked uncomfortable. "Don't make this inspirational," he said. "I'm doing my job." She nodded. "That's kind of the point." He corrected himself before leaving. "And I should let you do yours sooner." It was not reconciliation, but it was different from avoidance. Dana documented the rejected change without turning it into another disciplinary event. 30 days after the transit demonstration, the customer's field report came back clean. The corrected battery control units had completed the monitoring period without thermal faults, and the customer approved the next phase of deployment. The order would still be smaller than Claire had forecast for the quarter, but it was real revenue, not a promise held together by optimism. At the board review, Elena presented the field results. Claire introduced her as the person responsible for validation governance across the product group. The title came with a salary adjustment and formal decision rights, not just praise. Marcus watched Elena accept the role with the same cautious expression she used before starting a difficult test. Afterward, Claire found Marcus near the employee entrance where he had surrendered his badge weeks earlier. "I keep thinking about that check," she said. Marcus looked at her. "I don't." She nodded, almost embarrassed. "That's probably healthier." He told her the audit had 4 months left and would continue whether the next quarter looked good or bad. Claire agreed. Then she handed him a short list of 3 process failures employees had reported since the new system launched. No crisis, no hidden scandal, just ordinary problems finally being surfaced earlier. Marcus folded the page into his binder. The company was repairing itself in smaller, less dramatic ways now. That was harder to notice, and much harder to fake. 4 months later, Marcus arrived for the final audit review carrying the same worn binder he had brought on the day. Claire offered him $200 to leave. The company looked almost unchanged from the lobby, but the records told a different story. 3 supplier substitutions had been rejected before release, 2 software changes had been delayed for cross-functional testing, and technical objections now remained visible until formally resolved. The transit customer had expanded its order after 60 additional days of clean field data. Whitmore Dynamics had missed 1 quarterly target and kept every major customer. Claire called that trade-off expensive. Marcus called it measurable. The board's independent review closed Martin's disciplinary case with his warning intact and his unilateral approval authority permanently removed. He stayed with the company in a narrower operations role and completed the retraining Dana had recommended. More importantly, Elena's corrected performance record remained clean, and her new validation position gave her direct escalation access to the risk committee. She had hired 2 additional engineers to handle the workload rather than becoming the single brave person expected to stop every bad decision. When Marcus asked how the new team was functioning, Elena shrugged. "They argue with me a lot." He smiled. "Good, means you didn't hire mirrors." Claire's own consequences were less visible but more lasting. The board reduced part of her performance bonus after concluding that her schedule pressure had contributed to the culture that encouraged shortcuts. Even though she had not ordered anyone to bypass validation, she accepted the finding without appealing it. In the final meeting, she presented the results herself and did not describe the crisis as something her leadership had heroically solved. "We built incentives that made bad judgment easier," she said. "Then we were fortunate enough to catch the consequences before a customer did." Marcus noticed the sentence because it contained no request for forgiveness. After the meeting, Claire asked him to stay. Elena and Dana remained as well. Claire placed a new consulting offer on the table, this one for an ongoing advisory role with quarterly reviews. Marcus read the first page, then closed it. "No." Claire blinked, but she did not negotiate. He explained that the 6-month audit had done what it was supposed to do. If the controls survived only because he kept returning, they were not controls at all. Elena leaned back in her chair. "So you're abandoning me with these people?" Marcus looked at her. "You're the one who made them put your objections in permanent ink." Elena laughed. "Fair." That evening, Marcus met Naya at the community workshop. The 24-year-old volunteer he had helped months earlier was now teaching someone else how to test a motor before replacing it. Naya handed Marcus a screwdriver and pointed toward a donated mixer with a cracked housing. "Retirement project?" she asked. "I'm not retiring." "You reject one corporate contract and suddenly you're humble?" Marcus laughed and began removing the screws. His phones buzzed once with an email from Elena. The first quarterly audit without him had passed, though one product change had been held for additional testing. Marcus typed back, "Good. Let it take the time it takes." A week later, an envelope arrived from Whitmore Dynamics containing no check. Inside was the finalized audit report and a handwritten note from Claire thanking him for refusing to make himself necessary. Tucked behind it was a request from a regional manufacturing consortium asking whether he would help design an independent validation program shared by several smaller firms that could not afford full internal teams. Marcus read the request twice, then placed it beside his mechanical pencil. The problem was different, the scale wider, and nobody was asking him to rescue a company. Naya looked over his shoulder. "You're thinking about it." Marcus closed the binder, leaving the request inside. "I'm thinking about the terms."